And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to your weekly COVID-19 update stream. I apologize for not having any content out last week. I had a family matter come up that I had to deal with and didn't have any time for working on anything, really. But we are back this week to discuss all the craziness that is going on in the world. You know, on the last stream, there was a comment that was made recently that said everything in the news cycle feels like it's coming out of the onion. And I have to admit, it absolutely feels like that, yet it is the real news and emblematic of just how crazy the world's getting as the state utterly collapses into oblivion. As always, let's go ahead and start with taking a look at where the U.S. national debt and where the Federal Reserve's balance sheet are. So I'm looking at usdebtclock.org right now, and the U.S. national debt is $26,315,567,000. Excuse me, 567 million, and the thousands are growing too fast for me to say that. So still slower growth than had been in some of the immediate aftermath of COVID-19 breaking out. But don't hold your breath, because President Donald Trump has already expressed this week his desire to send out another round of stimulus checks, which will, of course, require some additional borrowing by the U.S. government. The Fed's balance sheet has slowed in its growth, but remains at about 7.1 trillion and is projected to be as high as 10 trillion by the end of 2021. We'll see if it even takes that long. But bottom line, despite what the media may be saying about recovery or spikes or everything else going on in America, make no mistake, the recession has not been staved off. The Federal Reserve continues to print money like mad in an effort to try and push it down the road. But as we've discussed before, they're only ensuring that when the crash finally comes, it is going to be that much tragically worse. But of course, we will get to that later in the stream. For at least initially, I'd like to talk about the developments in the whole disarm police hashtag defund police that has been circling around the internet, which was started with the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, but has since had the flames fanned by the death of Rashard Brooks having been shot by two Atlanta police officers. Now, for those of you, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what happened there, but for those of you that are not, a couple weeks ago, intoxicated man named Rashard Brooks was asleep in a Wendy's drive-thru, was approached by two Atlanta police officers. They talked with him for a while. Ultimately, when they tried to place him under arrest, he started fighting with the officers. In the course of the fight, he managed to take one of the officers' tasers and began running away. Another officer tried to tase him. While running, he turned and pointed the stolen taser at the officers and fired, at which point he got shot. So not exactly the same situation as George Floyd, to put it quite simply. But nonetheless, the cries of police are inherently racist when ringing up again. More calls around the nation to defund the police, more calls, more vast rioting across the nation. But in light of this, the Atlanta police chief stepped down. The officers were fired, have since been charged with murder, and numerous police officers in Atlanta have more or less called out sick, saying that they're not going back to work until they know that the city's got their backs and that they're going to be allowed to do their job of policing. And the same thing has been happening in other departments around the country. So, yeah, lots to talk about there, but that kind of sets the stage. And before I go further, Filthy Night Shift, you have any initial thoughts on the developments in the defund police crusade?
Well, I was just sorry. This is going to be a bit off topic, at least off topic for the time being. But you mentioned that that news is just becoming so crazy that it's starting to be more difficult to distinguish it from the onion. That's something called Poe's Law, I believe, where stories just become reality just starts to resemble more and more like a parody. And so just on a whim, I checked out the subreddit r/nottheonion, and here's what's at the top of the page right now. Petition calls for statue of Christopher Columbus in Ohio City to be replaced with Chef Boyardee.
And you never know, because you know how bad they want to get rid of Columbus. Yeah. The only reason I'd say I still believe that's fake is because Chef Boyardee is white, if I'm not mistaken.
It seems to be an actual news story. I don't. Yeah, Chef Boyardee. I mean, wait a bit. Is he white, or is he
Well,
like one
I
of
believe
those
so, yeah.
European ethnicities that are ambiguously white, like Italians?
okay. Some people consider Italians to be white, some people don't. So I guess that could be a real news story then. Pumpkin Row, thank you for the super chat. But Operation Mockingbird Media is the Onion. Fair
I mean,
enough.
that's true. Most of what they say is absolute complete nonsense. It's just that we're still waiting for the punchline.
Exactly.
So let's see here. What have we got in terms of the defund the police narrative? I was going to actually talk about this last week before the that stream was canceled. But I had a thought like a week or two ago about what is actually going on. And I think I'm going to make a video about this, but I think it's okay for me to explain my reasoning. So we know, for example, that Minneapolis city has completely defunded their police department, and the NYPD has suffered a 20% budget cut. And you're going to see similar things in city after city after city, in municipality after municipality. But with this in mind, the simple solution is that, oh, they're just caving into the demands of the mob, or oh, they're also liberal progressives, so they want to do this too. I think that there's actually a more mundane and simultaneously more complex answer, because I've been saying for a while now, and even a lot of statist libertarians and conservatives have even observed this, that states and municipalities across the country have been extremely tight with their purse strings. They are like bleeding money. And as a result, well, at some point, due to their increasing budget deficits, increasing debt, they are going to be forced to cut agencies at some point. Now, what do governments like to do when they have to cut agencies and have to cut budgets? Do they go after the pensions that are actually the driving force behind their deficits? No, of course not. Do they go after the unnecessary bureaucracies that not only make participating in the economy so much harder, but also are a significant cost in their own right? No, of course not. They're going to go after the most forward-facing agencies that the public is going to be interacting with the most. So for the national government, this is going to be things like parks and stuff. For states and municipalities, it's going to be teachers, it's going to be firefighters, it's going to be police officers. So what I think is going on here is that you have officers who we've seen them on video. We know they're antagonizing protesters. We know they're outright participating in the protests in order to make them more violent than they actually would be. And I think what they're actually trying to do is to create this defund the police narrative so that when these municipalities and these states are presented with this defund the police narrative, and then they do what their budget deficits would have required them to do anyway, they can go out and pretend like they're following the will of the people rather than, just doing what they would economically have to do in the first place.
Yep, I've been saying that pretty much from the start. I mean, we both have, but yeah, it's I joined like a couple minutes ago, so I don't know like which subject are we on?
Yeah.
We're talking about the defund the police stuff. Now, further proof that I have for this is that if there were these massive budget deficits, that's going to force them to start cutting police and start shutting agencies. You would also see this in additional areas, and we have, for example, in Ohio, that state's cutting funding to public schools. You're seeing other states with massive budget deficits, cities not renewing contracts with teachers' unions, and of course there's also large numbers of protests from teachers' unions protesting this stuff that's not really being talked about, and that is highly consistent with what I thought previously, that these counties, these states are experiencing very significant budget problems, and they're being forced to cut agencies. The reason that the police officers are being asked to stand down or even are unable to respond in the first place is simply because they don't have the resources to pull that off. we're entering Hollow State territory, and I think we're entering Hollow State territory very, very rapidly.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, I didn't really know exactly which specific subject we were on. But the thing is, though, everything we're gonna say about the subjects that are coming up, are essentially more or less the same broad point, even though they're different and unique to each subject.
Sorry about that. My connection cut out just there for a second. Go on.
No problem. Technical difficulties. It's a pain of doing these streams.
But yeah, we've been talking about for the last couple of streams now that it's becoming increasingly apparent, I think even to normies, that a lot of these white market firms and government agencies are becoming increasingly unable to merely sustain themselves. And that's pretty significant, and we're starting, like, in terms of the implications that's having on general social organization. And so on top of movements like defund the police or whatever, which are designed to give people the impression that governments are actively changing their own course of actions based on popular opinion, which of course it's not. This is just what they sort of have to do anyway. But the other thing that we're starting to see is, of course, the co-optation of state skeptic narratives. Well, that's not new, but you're starting to see very prominently that I think the state is beginning to become very scared of state skeptic. Like, it's starting to become a 4-letter word. Libertarianism and anarchy. And I think that not only is the state, trying to make people, trying to give them a loaded impression of what anarchy or libertarian philosophy is, but also the state is trying, and presumably we were going to cover the criminalize anarchy or whatever that bill is called later on in the stream, which is essentially just a warning shot to the counter economists.
And we will get to that bill later on in the stream.
Also, I just wanted to add something. I know that this is kind of a state-run thing. I know that this is something that the state is doing to try and draw people off. But I've got to say, it is kind of comical. It is kind of funny to see the police get a taste of their own medicine in a way, because for us to defend ourselves, like if somebody's holding up a store, or, if somebody's trying to rob us and we defend ourselves, usually we are arrested as citizens. We are arrested. We have to defend our actions in court, and the police don't usually have to do that. But now, the police are now getting a taste of their own medicine when they have to defend themselves and they're getting called out over it. I find that kind of comical, and I find it kind of funny that, it's finally the police that are getting a taste of their own medicine, and they're not liking it. They're being a bunch of crybabies. And it's like, you do this shit to us all the time and you don't like it done to you. Maybe that's like a message you should be heeding.
Oh yeah, I remember. Have you seen that clip of that New York police chief, I think it was, doing a press conference saying the media is dehumanizing us? I died when I first saw that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that was the head of the police union, but yes.
The head of the police union of NYPD, and his just reactions were absolutely hilarious. That whole press conference was just it was pure comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you treating us like animals? Because the instructions that you give us to not get shot are almost identical to those that you would give someone to encountering a wild bear.
Not to mention that the state very much treats police officers like they don't have free will. The criminal conviction rating for murder is 0.1%, And very often the state comes up with all of these ridiculous excuses like qualified immunity, which states that officers cannot be held accountable for their actions, almost like they don't have free will at all, which means they aren't moral agents. And if they aren't moral agents, well, that has a whole bunch of other very unpleasant implications. For one thing, it means that anyone in a romantic relationship with a police officer is engaged in bestiality.
Or they could take the simpler route, which is surprisingly better for them, that they're an unjustified ruling class, in which case they don't have a reason or right to exist. By which I mean their role, not them as people. Their role in society.
Now, one thing I wanted to point out is that amidst all the defund police that's going on right now, that the narrative seems to be aimed solely towards local and municipal police departments. Obviously, the federal government's not calling to disband the FBI or any other federal law enforcement agency. State governments aren't going to disband their state police agencies. At most, what is in practice being advocated is disbanding local and county departments in favor of more powerful, more comprehensive, centralized departments. So they're the people that are loudest in the defund. I mean, as much as I'm an advocate of privatizing police and security services, the people that are vocally calling to defund the police aren't actually asking to get rid of law enforcement per se. They're asking to transfer the function to a different group of people, but they're not opposed in principle to a sole group of armed enforcers that have the unilateral authority to impose the will of the state.
I've also noticed this narrative throughout the media of look at all these cities that are disbanding their police departments, or the amount of police active in them. It's going down. Now crime rates are going up, even though there's some cities that they're conveniently ignoring, like Atlanta, where that's not the case. And then there's also those thousands of small rural towns that don't have local police and haven't for years, and have non-existent crime statistics.
Yeah, what was interesting about that? The cities that are seeing spikes in crime, like Minneapolis, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, also happen to be some of the cities with the strictest gun control regulations.
Yep.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's something that could explain it for sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, I haven't done enough in-depth research to back that up with hard stats, but I'm just going to say, going with my gut, it makes sense that when you look at states that have some of the strictest gun control regulations, it's hardest for law-abiding citizens to obtain firearms with which to defend themselves. You get rid of the police, suddenly there's a spark in crime. In other states and cities where they don't have a strict gun control law and the majority of the population is armed, you get rid of the police and there's no corresponding rise in crime. In fact, crime actually drops. Gee, I wonder why.
It's very strange, but I mean, I've observed this when I've been watching the news sometimes, where people are always lamenting like, oh no, these crazy anarchists are just burning down the city. I'm just thinking, if even one person who owned that property would just did a rooftop Korean thing, the whole riots wouldn't even be a problem. What's the saying that like one man with a gun can hold down a room full of 30 people? You can imagine like if small coalition of gun owners were willing to defend their own property, these riots wouldn't even be an issue. But of course, as stated earlier, in every one of these cities, Seattle, Boston, actually I'm not sure about Boston, Washington, D.C., Chicago, all of these places that are just on fire right now, all of them have some of the strictest gun control in the country. New York City is, of course, a perfect example, where it takes like 6 months to get city approval to have a gun, and even then, like you only get approved if you're like friends with the mayor or something.
Well, and then there was also that situation in California. Like I'm not at all claiming that this is sort of the rule, But it seems as though police are going after people who actually try to defend themselves. In the instance I'm referring to specifically, some business owners in a coastal city, I want to say it was somewhere near like Santa Cruz. They attempted to defend themselves, with arms, of course. They attempted to defend their business against looters, and there was like this local news station that caught the entire thing on camera. And police ended up arresting the business owners who tried to defend their business.
Mm-hmm. Now, on that note, I would like to point out all these. There does seem to be an underlying method to the madness in what all these riots are seeking to accomplish. In that, you'll notice that the majority of businesses that are getting looted and destroyed are in fact small businesses. Meanwhile, large corporations are relatively untouched by what's going on. You've got all the various monuments and that are being toppled that depict. The only thing they have in common is that they're all white men being torn down. The defund the police is only aimed at local departments, but not at getting rid of armed enforcers and centralized authority per se.
What I would also warn people against in some of these cities where they're rolling back police is that I believe they did that in Boston not Boston, it was Baltimore a few years ago. They stopped police deployments in certain areas. I don't know if they actually closed the police station, but they rolled back. Sorry, I can't talk right now. They rolled back police deployments in certain parts of the city, and at first the people were having problems with that, but then they started going after people that tried to arm up and people that were trying to get who were trying to own firearms there. And they actually started going after people like that for and it looked to be people that were living in the neighborhoods where they'd rolled back the police. It looked like some of those people were trying to arm up, and the police that were left started going after them. So I mean, it is like that. It's basically like, you try to defend yourself, or you try to replace them by doing things yourself. And it will.
I didn't know.
Like they're going to come after you for that.
Yeah, I didn't know exactly whether or not that had happened yet in this particular in this particular time during these riots, but the state definitely does have an incentive to do that, for the same reason that they have an incentive to make it, more difficult to start up your own business and to own your own production and to disassociate from their white market firms. It's all about control. It's all about making you dependent on legal institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And that really does seem to be the underlying narrative, the underlying goal of everything that's going on. Even though it might seem disparate they might seem disparate and disconnected as individual events, but the goal to destroy small businesses, to get rid of smaller municipal departments in favor of one larger centralized force, to perpetuating the cultural Marxist narrative of oppressor class and oppressed class, hence the need for a stronger, more intrusive state.
Well, there is an oppressor and oppressed class. It's the rulers versus the non-rulers.
The people, yeah.
Indeed, but they instead convince you it's the boogeyman, the cisgendered white male, versus the black transgendered, whatever they're calling it now.
I mean, it's very. I'm sure I pointed this out before, but I can't help but marvel at how quickly they managed to hijack the narrative from actually legitimate criticisms of police conduct and police brutality, all the way to it's just cisgendered white males.
Mm-hmm. And now on that note, obviously the killing of George Floyd was unjustified. Now in the case of Rayshard Brooks, well, it certainly doesn't justify the existence of police as an institution. I would say him getting shot was not nearly on the level of what happened to George Floyd, regardless of whether or not you think it was a justified shooting. But still, they immediately latched onto it as a white police officer shoots black man, not anything else. Even considering how radically different it was, in that it wasn't black man in handcuffs being suffocated by a police officer while other people watched on. I mean, it wasn't a guy who was actively resisting and then fired a taser at the cop. So, but still, that what the important thing that happened, that they latched onto in the narrative, was that it was a white police officer shooting a unarmed black male, even though he wasn't really unarmed. But it had to be phrased in that particular narrative format.
But yeah, that sort of is what characterizes what Konkin referred to as third stage agorism, when the state is practically like it's a shell of what it would be even a year or two ago, and it invests most of its resources just trying to stop people from becoming separated from the legal economy and from dependence on the state. So, and that's sort of what we're, that's what we're seeing with the state going after the only people that the state going after in these riots being the people who are trying to defend themselves with guns.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be clear, we're not at third stage agorism yet. However, the state is rapidly dissolving, and its power is starting to unravel. And I think it's becoming. I think it's the extent. I think the extent to which the government is antagonistic to people is starting to become more and more undeniable.
We're not
to the average individual.
We're not at third stage agorism yet, but we burned through second stage agorism really quickly.
Well, on that note, moving on to the next topic I'd like to discuss. So amidst all this defund police narrative that was going on and the Black Lives Matter protests and the toppling of statues, the media temporarily forgot about COVID-19. You know, COVID-19, this horrible virus that was going to destroy life as we know it on Earth, was suddenly unimportant, because if you're going out without a mask on in order to show your solidarity and support of the fact that Black Lives Matter and the police are an inherently racist and unjust institution, well, absolutely no problem with that, because COVID has no power over Black Lives Matter. But once that died down a little bit, all of a sudden, COVID-19 came roaring back into the media cycle with a vengeance. Dr. Fauci and the President's Task Force have had a press conference this week about the state of the nation. Many states are ramping up their rolling back lockdown procedures are now going back to them. More cities and states are making it mandatory to wear a face mask in public, and all of a sudden, so despite the fact that COVID had no power over Black Lives Matter, it again represents a clear and present threat to the state of America if you're doing anything other than going out and protesting for Black Lives Matter.
Well, I mean, a lot of these so-called spikes that we're hearing about, it's not really a spike. What ends up happening is that in Texas specifically, they went to one meatpacking facility. They tested the employees there, and many of them turned out positive for COVID-19. And that's largely where the so-called spike came from. Not to mention that if you pay close attention to the way certain article headlines are written, they're incredibly deceptive. Each one, like, you'll see new record highs of COVID-19 when the actual record that's even being broken is that there is now one more case of COVID-19 in the nation than there was before. We broke the record. This is more cases of COVID-19 than we've ever seen before, even though the actual rate of new people being infected is probably very low, to say nothing of the extremely limited testing that has been in place since the very beginning.
Not to mention the extremely low death rate and the fact that hospitals are basically being rewarded for declaring that they've had patients die from COVID-19, in that they receive more federal aid the more deaths they report due to COVID-19.
Yeah, and I remember that the Lieutenant Governor of Texas has outright admitted that the overwhelming majority of ICU hospital beds aren't even occupied, and those that are, only a tiny fraction of them are from COVID-19 patients. So it's hardly even a problem. In fact, this is extremely overblown, and the way that the media is treating this is clearly meant to be deceptive, clearly meant to maintain a fear mongering, which shows that, yeah, they have very much an interest in keeping people afraid. Now, they have, of course, a financial interest, because if people are afraid, that means that they'll watch the news, which means ratings. And in the meantime, I believe it was the World Health Organization or the CDC admitted that for patients under 70 years old, the death rate is 0.02, which is nothing.
That 0.02 mortality rate, though.
Which is less than
nothing.
the common flu.
I mean, if you think about how you would actually catch COVID, odds are every single one of us here has probably had it and we didn't even know it.
Yeah, and and JC Armitage in the comments said that it's a 1/50th of a percent. Yeah, in other words, it's 1 in 5,000. You're gonna be, if you catch it, you're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just it is amazing to me that more people aren't picking up on the fact that they don't even believe their own narrative, given they're willing to say that so long as you're protesting for Black Lives Matter, it doesn't matter. Go out, do everything you can. Doesn't matter if you wear a mask. But if you're doing anything else, by golly, you had better be wearing a mask when you go out, or you better not go out at all. In fact, we probably should just lock down for another 9 months. And this is this is an aside, probably not worth getting down this rabbit trail. But I do want to point out that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted out that we need to keep the lockdown going to ensure the economy does worse, because if the economy starts to recover, Donald Trump might get reelected. She subsequently deleted the tweet, but enough people screenshotted it that it was getting spread around Twitter.
Once it's on the internet, it's on there forever.
Exactly.
And it makes sense that when you have an ongoing Roman civil war, except without the actual fighting, you're going to do whatever it takes to try to grab as much power as you can. And this is something I've been observing in the political ruling class as well. That although they all have a similar hegemonic interest in increasing the size and power of the state, each politician and each party is going to have their own individual preferences as to what to use the size and power of the state to accomplish. And so, you get elections, you get all of this stuff, you get these soft and hard coups that are being thrown around. Of course, it's all political theater and political drama, not really worth getting into. But I think it's just worth pointing out nonetheless that...
Well, and they might have an individual interest to undermine each other, but they have a collective interest to promote the state. I'd be willing to bet, honestly, the AOC only even tweeted that to give people the impression that that's what the COVID lockdown was trying to accomplish.
It's possible. I wouldn't rule it out. But let me see here. I had a thought.
The thing I've always said about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is she really as stupid as she seems, or is she in fact an evil genius pretending to be stupid in order to accomplish a greater end? The world may never know.
She's put out hot takes which contradict statements she's made previously, where she clearly demonstrates knowledge of the thing that the hot take would indicate she doesn't know about. So yes, she is faking being stupid.
It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if she was if she was basically just kind of the evil genius that you think she might have.
Like the three chambers of government gaffe, for instance. She's demonstrated the knowledge of of those positions, so she knows how they are, how they function legally and what they are.
Well, on that note, then, next thing to discuss when it comes to the political factions trying to warring with each other, President Donald Trump, who from the beginning has assured us that we have the strongest economy in the world. COVID, unfortunately, threw that off, but the moment that America reopens, we'll go right into a V-shaped recovery. And in fact, has since said that as states began opening, a V-shaped recovery has already begun. This week has again called for another round of stimulus checks to be sent out to every American, which begs the question, if we really are beginning a V-shaped recovery and as states are rolling back their respective lockdown procedures. Why on earth would it be necessary to give another round of stimulus checks?
Largely because he knows what he's saying is complete bullcrap, but he wants to try to give people the impression that everything's going better than it actually is. I mean, he's saying one thing and doing another. I really don't know if there's much more to it other than trying to literally bribe people to vote for him.
Money printer.
Money printer go brr.
Yep, and I see that's popped up several times in the chat already.
Oh yeah.
Well, naturally, MMT is a hell of a drug. You can basically just print infinite money and nothing will ever go wrong.
Never forget that meme was originally made to jab at Austrolibs.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the note of modern monetary theory, on Mises.org, Bob Murphy put out an excellent article that critiquing modern monetary theory that I do suggest everybody go check out. But yeah, despite wanting to talk about that, make sure we bring that up. There really isn't much to say. In the previous streams, we talked quite a bit about where that's going. So on that note, Filthy, want to go ahead and bring up the domestic anarchy bill from the state of Michigan?
Yeah, sure. Let me just pull that up real quick. I didn't actually have that. I actually didn't have that.
Very quickly, I just want to note also that apparently two major Chinese state-backed corporations defaulted today. Qinghai Provincial Investment Group, which I think is a bank. It's an asset bank, and Kaizen Magazine. So that's a big deal. It's starting to affect China now.
Well, China's economy has always been, Potemkin. It's fake.
Yeah,
it's something built entirely off of fake infrastructure projects that don't actually produce any value.
I'm aware of that. I was the one who first pointed out on one of these streams, how their GDP figure doesn't even, of all their provinces combined, don't even add up to 100%. But yeah, so that's a big deal though, because since their entire economy is based on debt, once they're kind of gonna have a regional equivalent of what's gonna happen to the global economy, where some of these are gonna start defaulting, and then within a month or two, their entire legal economy is going to have defaulted.
Whatever wealth they squandered from Hong Kong will run out very quickly.
Yeah, I think it's the main reason why they cracked down so hard on Hong Kong, because they need to plunder it for the resources that it has.
But yeah, on to the domestic anarchy bill, because we both have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, this should be fun.
All right, so the legislature of the state of Michigan put forward House Bill number 5900. Among the things, it introduces a new legal charge called domestic anarchy, which is supposed to be a step up from domestic terrorism, because as everybody knows, anarchism is worse than terrorism. But what they're going to do is make it a crime punishable by up to 20 years in prison and up to a $250,000 fine if one engages in certain acts that the government has arbitrarily deemed to be an act of social and domestic anarchy.
Now, the way that the bill is being advertised makes it seem as if it's intended to target people who riot and loot stores, like the people that you're seeing on the news. Now, your first red flag should be the fact that, as far as I'm aware, that was already a crime. But yeah, of course, if you actually read the bill, that's not at all what the state's intention here is.
Yeah, think of it like hate. Here's a good example of that. Think about hate crime legislation. So if you strangle and kill your grandmother, that's just murder. But if you strangle and kill a black man, then that's a hate crime.
Yeah,
What?
and somehow because you're a different race, somehow they can judge your thoughts and actions based on that. And somehow, because you're engaging in thoughts that they don't like, this makes the crime even more severe. It's literal thought crime. Now, what makes this interesting is that under Section 543B, Part A, Part 3, freaking hell, I don't know how this is numbered. You have something that is written as follows, which is intended to define what social and domestic anarchy is: an act that is intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence or affect the conduct of government or a unit of government through intimidation or coercion.
Effect.
Yeah,
Effect.
and it goes on to describe, to elaborate further in what it means by this. You want to read that section, or
Which part?
hold on, I can pull it up really quick here, where it's defining what it means by effect and influence government institutions through intimidation or coercion, because it doesn't mean violence. Obviously, that's already a crime, as we already noted. It defines this as, quote, material support or resources, currency or other financial securities, financial services, lodging, training, safe houses, false documentation or identification, communications, equipment, facilities, weapons, basically just counter economics is how it defines this.
Oh wow! Didn't China and Russia try something like this?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it failed miserably, as far as I remember.
It was aimed
correct?
specifically at the crypto markets. This is aimed generally at just people who are associating outside of legislated licensed means.
Suffice to say, the purpose of this is to propagandize to normies, just people who generally don't know anything about what's actually going on. That this is going to increase the penalties and impose law and order on these violent rioters, and of course that's how it's going to be advertised. But what it's actually going to do is, well, it's going to be useful for the state as a propaganda tool as we approach stage 3 anarchism, or I'm sorry, stage 3 agorism. While the state will be entering a hollow state and its ability to enforce its will be greatly diminished, that doesn't mean that there won't be any counter economists that they won't be able to catch whatsoever. It just means that those that they do catch will be subject to more severe penalties, and basically they'll be made an example out of. So the kind of thing that I think I predicted years ago when I was doing a counter narrative to, I don't remember, some video about what the world would look like without taxes or something.
Uh-huh.
That counter economists would just generally be made an example out of by the state. Will it work? Of course not. But it makes the statists feel good. It makes them feel scared, and it might have some effects in the future. But ultimately, it'll be too little, too late.
It's also intended to create the impression that gray market trade is not as secure as it actually is. But in reality, if the state could do anything about it, they already would have.
And I think the vague language also goes to another debate that's been going on, where with some recent Supreme Court cases, there's been some mainstream media discussion about what the proper role of the judicial branch is. But as you can see in those cases, what ends up happening is you have legislation that is in some way ambiguous. It's not clear exactly what the people who wrote it meant. So it then goes before a judge, an unelected bureaucrat, or group of judges who then unilaterally say this is what it means. And the politicians who crafted the legislation have plausible deniability. They can say, that's not necessarily what they meant, but nonetheless, the judges have spoken. And now a terribly vague law has very specific implications that the people have that the democratic process has no way of countervening.
which judges in the future could also just interpret in any way that they want.
Yep.
Because that's sort of, that's one of the fundamental criticisms of the concept of a rule of law imposed through legislative means, and that is that the concepts which these laws are intended to represent are arbitrary or have competing meanings. So the idea of trying to create one uniform law that just means one thing is not possible. That's not how language works.
All right. Well, on that note, that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover on this stream. If anybody has anything additional they'd like to cover, go ahead and put it in the chat now.
Oh, we're just going to be reading chat comments.
Think so.
Nice.
Near the end here. That's usually how I like to end.
I mean, we haven't done that in a while now because we've always been, going over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this will be cool. So, anyways, Luna Protege asks, what are the stages of agorism?
Stage 0 agorism. The philosophy doesn't exist, and no one is a practicing counter-economist. Stage 1 agorism is there are individual counter-economists here and there, but they're not that active. And, well, I mean, they're active, but they're not really promoting the ideas. They might not know what the ideas are. Not that it's really that important to agorism anyway. Stage 2 agorism is when an infrastructure begins to develop independently of the white market's infrastructure. That's when people are profiting so consistently through counter-economic means that they aren't dependent necessarily on white market institutions and are able to invest capital into trying to set up like decentralized defense firms or things that would allow them to communicate without proprietary software, just for examples. Stage 3 agorism is essentially when very few people to no people at all are dependent on state institutions, and the state institutions are struggling just to sustain themselves, and what little function they have in society is to try and is basically just fighting with counter economists and people trying to live independently from them. They've dropped all pretense of trying to be benevolent and are just openly behaving in an aggressive manner towards people. And stage 4 agorism, the final stage, is when the state doesn't exist anymore.
There will still be, of course, statist impurities, people who still hold on to the belief in the state. And the fact of the matter is, we're probably going to be dealing with those kinds of people for generations to come. But for the most part, their ability to actually affect society as a whole and their ability to implement their idealization of aggression is just simply going to be non-functional. Ultimately, the belief in statism will become an anachronism, much in the same way that the belief in feudalism and the belief in slavery is an anachronism. And yeah, they'll just fade.
Pumpkin Row mentioned, I did bring this up on the screen earlier, though I didn't want to interrupt Filthy at the time, but I see Pumpkin Row would like their the $2 super chat to get read, which was, okay, but relations with a cockroach is bestiality.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
It is.
It is. I mean, you can also tell by the 40% abuse rate.
Okay, liberal. If it's
I mean-
not bestiality, then how come they're called the cockroaches? Checkmate.
I mean, don't believe everything you hear. Not every cockroach is abusive to their spouse. 60% of them don't hit their spouses at all.
And I would like to say, as far as how broadly the feminism has defined the concept of abuse, I'd be willing to bet many of those cases, whatever was alleged, didn't even remotely come close to actual abuse. But that's a whole nother topic.
Remember that troll who was pretending to be a feminist that claimed that somebody saved her from drowning and was filing a lawsuit against him for sexual harassment?
Yeah, I do.
Hashtag save rape or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
That was so long. That was like when Gamergate was a thing. That was so long.
Yeah.
I don't even...
That seems so long ago now.
Oh no, we're at that point in our lives where things that were like 5 to 6 years ago seem like they're that long. They're so long.
Yeah, exactly.
In the past.
They don't seem that long to me, but I mean, like I'm remembering things that felt like they were fairly recent to me, and then I'm learning like, wait, that was 12 years ago. And it just
I remember
blows my
watching.
mind.
Yeah, I remember watching a lot of like this was before I was a libertarian. I remember though watching a lot of like the Gamergate streams like as they were happening. It's crazy. And those are like 6 years old.
And Albedo asks, you head how cryptocurrency usage is on the rise in Africa?
I'm gonna guess
Yeah,
he meant heard, but
Yeah, I know, but I just like I just like pronouncing things as they're written. It's funny. But yeah, we have heard, and it's absolutely glorious.
mhm.
It's very much showcasing that even in the third world, that the state is beginning to unravel. And of course, we all recognize that the state everywhere across the world is not going to unravel at the same time. Some
my understanding
governments are going to be. Sorry?
I was going to say, it's my understanding that crypto use is on the rise in pretty much every country that has had their central bank default. Between Venezuela, Africa, Lebanon, and some of these other smaller countries that their central banks have defaulted, all of them are seeing an increase in crypto usage.
Yeah, that's even starting to be the case in places where the central bank hasn't defaulted. In fact, my just not too long ago, my grandma started a crypto wallet, and I was been asking, blowing up my phone, asking me to help her with that.
Well, that's good. I mean, I know that your parents think you're a Marxist. So,
Yeah.
I mean, how do your parents feel about their mother asking a Marxist for advice on crypto wallets?
I haven't asked them yet. I guess I can after the stream's over, and then I can tell you all in Discord what they said.
Oh, that would be beautiful. So let me see here. JC Armitage asks if sleeping with genetically engineered cat girls would be considered bestiality. If it's sapient and she consents, no. I mean, that's a fairly simple answer.
I see Albedo also answered that one.
Yeah.
However, I don't feel particularly inclined to allow that that train of thought to keep going, because that will probably get this stream kicked out.
Yeah.
So what you're saying? Are you saying that if they could genetically engineer mermaids, you wouldn't want a mermaid girlfriend?
We'll have this discussion later, Night Shift.
Okay. I'm just trolling.
All right. Well, on that note, not quite at the hour yet, but I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover for this stream. As always, thanks everybody for being here. Filthy, Night Shift SO, and I see JC Armitage apologize. You're forgiven. All right. Well, as always, guys, that is my 2 cents. You can take it for what it's worth.